Good afternoon, and welcome to another College of Business Thought Leadership Series event. The Thought Leadership Series is a platform that brings cutting-edge research to life and invites you to explore how academic insights can shape real-world impact. This afternoon's session, Turning Anger into Insight, Using Emotion for Better Outcomes, with Dr. Laura Rees, dives into the surprising power of emotion in decision-making, leadership, and communication. If you've ever wondered how to harness frustration or anger for good, this is the conversation for you. I'm Kate Popinsick, Assistant Director of Advancement, focused on alumni and volunteer engagement here in the College of Business, and I'm honored to be your host for today's event. I am joined by Dr. Jay Hardy, our Associate Dean for Research, and Dr. Laura Rees, Associate Professor of Organizational Leadership. Today's Thought Leadership Series event takes a slightly different approach than what we've done in the past. Instead of a traditional presentation, we're creating space for an engaging, interview-style dialogue with our featured faculty member, Dr. Laura Rees, who will unravel the elements of anger, which is often seen as a negative emotion, and explain how it can be a powerful catalyst for clearer decisions, courageous leadership, and personal growth. Dr. Jay Hardy will lead the conversation today, drawing on his research expertise to ask thought-provoking questions that we believe are on your minds too, diving deeper into the topic in a way that's both insightful and accessible. We'll also reserve time for you to join the conversation. You'll have the opportunity to ask Dr. Rees your own questions, share your own reflections, and explore the ideas that resonate most with you. So now I am pleased to turn things over to Dr. Jay Hardy. As our Associate Dean of Research, Jay is committed to advancing our research mission and cultivating a strong culture of academic excellence within the College of Business.
Hi everyone, and thanks for joining us for our Spring Thought Leadership Series event. My name is Jay Hardy, the Steerick Associate Dean for Research here in the College of Business at Oregon State University. We launched this series to shine a light on some of the innovative research happening in the college, work that tackles some of the most pressing issues facing businesses and communities today. Sharing it more broadly through events like this helps us live out our land-grant mission by showing how the research housed in our college can make a real difference in people's lives across Oregon and beyond. It's been another standout year for research in the College of Business. In the last year alone, our faculty published more than 40 peer-reviewed articles with contributions spanning 35 different scholars. 14 of these papers appeared in the top business journals in the world. We also doubled our grant-funded research awards for the second year in a row. And through our 8 faculty-led centers of excellence, we partnered with industry on nearly 24 applied research projects, work that's driving real-world solutions and business growth. Research truly matters here in the College of Business. And through efforts like this, we're proud to help grow the impact and the reputation of both the college and Oregon State University as a whole. Today, it is my privilege to introduce our featured faculty speaker, Dr. Laura Rees, Associate Professor in the College of Business. Dr. Rees is a world-renowned expert in the science of how emotions, habits, attitudes, and authenticity shape performance and well-being in the workplace, with her research spanning negotiation, decision-making, persuasion, and interpersonal dynamics. Her work, known for its rigorous multi-method approach, has been published in the leading journals such as Academy of Management Review and Journal of Applied Psychology. She brings her cutting-edge research into the classroom, teaching courses like influence and negotiation, ethics, leadership, and organizational behavior, and has authored numerous cases and led workshops for students and executives alike. Laura holds a PhD from the University of Michigan with an AB in economics from Harvard, and she is currently co-developing 2 global podcast series focused on the practical application of research in negotiation and conflict management. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Laura Rees, whose work continues to shape how we understand influence, emotion, and communication in today's evolving business landscape.
Thanks so much for having me, Jay. I'm super thrilled to be here and talk to you about these topics.
Great, welcome. So I'm going to go ahead and lead off with our first question here. How can we handle anger more effectively?
Well, I'll respond with a bit of a teaser for that because I know we're going to get much more into the details as we go. But think about the metaphor of anger as water flowing through a garden hose. So this metaphor arose naturally in the process of our research as we came to understand all of the nuances around anger, but we really found it fairly helpful in unpacking kind of the when, where, how, and why of anger and its effects on people. It's one of our biggest insights, I think, that anger doesn't stay still. It has to move. So keep this metaphor in mind, but I know we're going to get a lot more into the details as we go.
Okay, a garden hose, interesting. So tell me a little bit more about the science of this topic. Can you kind of unpack a little bit more about how you developed a framework around this and what that looks like?
Sure, so this is where we get much more, I'm not sure if we have the slide up exactly. Here, do we? Okay, so we have the three pitfalls, as I call them, of emotions, but each of those pitfalls is actually kind of an opportunity when you reframe that in a different way. So the first one is we miss a lot of information. We also misunderstand the information, and we sometimes assume things about it that are not exactly true. So the first one, for emotional intelligence, we know in theory a lot of people hear emotional intelligence and they think they understand what that means about recognizing and adapting to emotion, managing those, this kind of thing. But there are really, in practice, a lot of nuance behind that that's much more difficult than what we see in just hearing about the term emotional intelligence. The first one is what's called ideal affect. So affect is a broader term for emotions. It means emotions, moods, this kind of thing. Don't focus on that. But the idea of ideal affect is that by culture, we have different ideas of what's useful and good and normal to express emotionally. One of the most interesting studies about this actually looked at children's storybooks in more Eastern countries versus more kind of the US and more of the Western countries, and found that how children were expressing, even in pictures and text, those emotions of whether we were more excited on a playground or more sedate or something like this really differed by culture. And we learn that. We're socially kind of involved in that as children even, of learning what's ideal in that environment. And we tend to learn how to express that as we go, to be normative in our societies. The second piece is that we differ a lot in expressivity, naturally, and also some cultural differences there too. So I use my hands a lot. My students know this. And there it is on the screen, so you can reference that as well. But that means that it's different to interpret what I mean when I'm waving my hands around versus what you might mean when you're waving your hands around. And how we understand, is that really a dramatic reaction from Jay and maybe a less dramatic reaction from Laura, or this kind of thing. But if we take a step back for a second, I do want to talk about this misinterpretation, because this is one of the coolest pieces of, I think, research, and one of the biggest areas where you can help yourself by focusing more on these kinds of ideas. In theory, one of the most common theories that we use is called emotions as social information, the EC theory. But as I tell my students, emotions are anything but EC. And don't worry, they don't laugh either, so that's okay. But in practice, I like to use this illustration. If you think of one of the most ubiquitous expressions that you see on a daily basis, on the face, that's a smile, right? And you think, okay, well, that's easy to interpret and to understand. What does a smile mean?
Sure.
Research shows us that there are up to 19 different meanings behind a smile.
Wow.
So that one really simple, really ubiquitous expression is incredibly complex to understand. It can mean I'm happy. Sure, that's kind of obvious. It can also just mean, in many cultures, I'm listening. I hear you. It can mean I'm confused, I don't know what else to do, or I'm just trying to be polite. It can actually also mean I'm angry, right? So in some sense, the opposite of happy. So it's a really complex emotion to understand. And the third factor here, the third pitfall or opportunity, depending on how you frame that, is that we're often really influenced without realizing it. And here we get into some of the neuroscience research that shows that emotions are primary. So they're precognitive. So whenever somebody says, oh, I don't let my emotions influence me, or I'm not emotional about that, you're just wrong scientifically, unless there's some really rare circumstances when that's not the case. But those emotions are already there before we've even had time to think about them or to say they're not influencing me. Two ideas behind this are, first, the idea of core affect, and that's anger doesn't just pop into my head, oh, I'm angry. First, this idea that you have a general sense of bad, negative, or good, positive. And it's actually only when you cognitively appraise that and realize, oh, I'm angry right now, not I'm afraid or happy or something else. So it's that interplay between that initial core affect that's precognitive and your cognitive appraisal and reappraisal of that emotion that really changes what that emotion does. And I think we're going to share some stories later about looking at that in practice. One of my favorite studies of this kind of research in practice is there was a great piece of research, and I wish I could show you the graph, but I'm happy to share that study with anybody who's interested, looked at judges making parole decisions. And there's a classic graph that shows the percentage approval rate for that parole request and the order in which that case was seen. And the graph shows about 65% approval rate that then falls kind of gradually to some point, almost zero. Mm-hmm. And then there's a kind of a dotted line showing something dramatic happens here, and it goes back up to 65%, falls again to zero, something dramatic happens, and the same is repeated. And when I ask my students, they come up with really wonderful ideas about explaining what happened. Maybe they saw the cases in a certain order, the easy ones first, and then et cetera, or different cases were awarded to different judges, and that's why we're seeing this pattern. But the difference is from a 2/3% acceptance rate of this parole request to zero, effectively, was when the judges had a food break.
Sure.
They had those 2 food breaks and that bumped it back up. And if you looked at across the day, you would have said, yeah, it's maybe about 35, 40% acceptance. That seems very reasonable. There was no difference across judges. If you ask the judges, no, there's no explicit bias or any kind of thing like that. It's honestly that they didn't recognize they were being influenced by this really kind of mundane thing that can influence our emotions.
Very complicated idea, very well articulated. There's a lot going on here, right? There's a lot that's influencing us. There's a lot that we are influenced by. We are social creatures. We're existing in this construct where we're surrounded by other people that are reading and incorrectly reading. We're putting out signals that we may not think that we're always putting out. It's a lot to keep track of, and I can imagine as a emotions researcher, you are thinking about this a lot in your day-to-day interaction. So I'll take it kind of in a new angle then. So knowing what you know now, if you were to give some advice to somebody that is looking to improve the way that they manage, direct, and kind of point their garden hose in their own life, what might you say? Knowing a little bit more about this process, how can people use this to their own practical benefit?
I love this question. And actually, could we start with an example? Probably we all have many examples in which we were angry recently. I know I could give you many, but I'd like to hear one from you. Do you have an example of?
Sure. So just this weekend, I was driving through Corvallis. Anybody that has been through Corvallis can probably relate to the experience of driving through downtown and the variations in the speed at which people like to do that. So I was driving through downtown. I had my kids in the back seat, and I look in my rearview mirror, and there was somebody right on my tailgate. I was like, okay, well, maybe this is just, maybe I'm coming up to a stoplight, slowing down. I looked back in the mirror, they're speeding up, they're slowing down, they're coming within inches of my bumper. I'm trying to rack my brain. What is going on? What is happening here? Did I cut this person off? Did I send some kind of signal? Is there maybe a bumper sticker that they don't like on my car? Before I had a chance to process that, though, this individual's pulling around me, swinging by me, giving me a nasty look as he peels off to the next light, turns left, never see him again. I'll be honest, this was a situation where I was in pretty calm state of mind, but in the minutes, and in fact, I'd say over the next 30 minutes, I ran through this scenario over and over in my head, and I felt myself just boiling up, just wishing that some punishment would become of this guy. Maybe a police officer would pull him over, or some form of justice would come in through the universe. And I realized that it was changing the tone of the conversation that I was having with my son, and that I needed to check this. So what can I do in this situation, right? This was an experience I didn't ask for. This was an emotion that I didn't feel like I had full control over. What can I do to manage my emotions in this situation?
And it's such a relatable story. I think we all probably, maybe we were that driver at one point, but also kind of knowing your perspective too. So it's a fantastic example to walk through the framework. So I'll save you reading the massive paper that we put together and help you unpack that a little bit here. But a few thoughts. So one, it seems that that initial anger for you, that response, was triggered by what is called a moral or a norm violation. Okay. That's just not how we drive in Corvallis, right? You might have had a different reaction if it had been in LA or New York or somewhere like this, but that's just not normative here. Mm-hmm. So there's a huge violation there, which I'll talk in a moment. That's one of the two main triggers of feeling angry. But second is we don't actually know a lot about the scene here, particularly that other person's perspective, right? We don't know if they were truly angry. And you mentioned they looked like they were yelling and maybe waving or gesticulating in some way or something. Interestingly, frustratingly, the research shows us that the more expressive you are physically, the harder it can actually be to determine what emotion they're expressing. You'd think it would be a stronger, clearer signal, but it's actually almost more confusing in that sense. So they could have been angry at you doing something, as you guessed, but they could have also been really scared that they were on their way to the hospital, a parent maybe taking their last breath, and they were like, why is this person going so slowly? I need to get there.
Yeah.
Right? So it had nothing to do with you. Or they could have just been super excited. Maybe a partner was giving birth and they really needed to get, I don't know why the hospital is the place to go in Corvallis. But there's a lot that could be happening there that's just really hard to know from your perspective. So one of the pieces of advice that I share with students often, and I try to do this in my own life as well, is if you can think, what would make what this person is doing or thinking or feeling the right thing to be doing or thinking or feeling in that moment? You don't have to agree with it, but if you can get to that point, that at least helps you understand perhaps what that perspective is. And then another aspect of the scene is that you were in that scene too.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting that you thought, I was boiling, I was super angry, et cetera. So this gets back to what I was saying was one of those pitfalls and or opportunities. Were you really angry? Or maybe you had this sense of alarm, surprise, maybe even a little fear. What's happening? What's going on? Am I in danger? That you then translated into anger. Once you realize this is a violation, this is not how we drive here, this person is in the wrong, and therefore I'm angry. So each of those pieces of the scene can help us unpack maybe what we can do differently or how we can at least take a moment and understand what's happening before you go chasing them down the street in anger.
Yeah. Lots to track in my mind in that moment. Certainly there was a lot of emotions that I was processing. There was a lot of rationalizing that I was trying to do. And it was interesting to see how a lot of those various pieces came together. So tell me a little bit more about the science and the model and the framework that you've built around this idea. This is something I think a lot of us very intuitively understand, and you've given us a nice way to kind of set up and frame this concept. Can you kind of elaborate a little bit more on the things that you've learned as you've studied this topic?
Right. Well, the one most important thing I think is understanding where anger comes from, because that actually kind of really helps put some boundaries around it in a really helpful way. So we know that anger is typically triggered by one of two types of things, sometimes a combination. The first is personal goal frustration. You got in my way, you prevented me from doing something, you steal my lunch from the fridge, don't do that. Then I'm hungry, so I'm angry, and then I'm not going to approve any parole decisions, I guess, as well. The second one, though, besides that personal goal frustration, is more general moral or norm violation. And that may be, you may have had actually a mix of both in your experience because they got in your way, you weren't able to go down the street safely in the way that you had planned, but also this is just not how things are done, or this breaks some guidelines that we have for how society works. But overall, anger, as we have studied, and you can be angry at yourself, but we kind of put that aside for the sake of this kind of integrative review, it's a social emotion. So remember what I said about emotions is social information. So if you think about that as an informational thing, what does that mean? It means that there's some idea of blame and responsibility, maybe at the universe, maybe at the driver, maybe at something else, and it's a strong signal that demands a response. I want you to fix it. Whoever you're angry at or whatever caused that anger, you want it to be corrected, right? So when we understand that, we think, okay, so there's a problem here. We can focus more on that problem-solving approach, and that's some of the more adaptive, productive behavioral responses that we talk about in the paper. And some of my other work has also shown if we're negotiating or having some kind of conversation about this and you show me anger, if I can think, oh, that's a signal, remember what the research tells us, and I can ask you questions to unpack why you're angry, what really matters to you, or what violation has happened, or why what goal is being frustrated, that question asking can actually really help us create value and get to a better answer than otherwise.
Great. So I'm going to take it in another direction, kind of related to the conversation that we've had. One thing that I have realized as I've been communicating what research looks like in the College of Business is that a lot of the topics that we study here are things that people are familiar with. And the hard thing, I think, for a lot of people to wrap their heads around is, well, how do you actually study that? This is a really beautiful model. This is very interesting. It's a very nice way of unpacking it. How did you go about studying this concept? What are some of the methods and some of the approaches that you use to understand anger better?
Sure. Well, let me take a step back and explain why we found it so fascinating. And as I was sharing with you before this hour started, I think anger is one of the coolest emotions. It's just really fascinating to me. And I didn't start out trying to be an anger scholar. It just sort of happened, but I really think it's just one of those ones that we need to unpack more. And you can see on the slide, part of what piqued our interest is a strength, but also kind of an opportunity in the field, is that there's a lot of research on anger. In fact, when we did a search, more than half of all that's been published on anger in this huge variety of fields that we looked at has been in the past decade. So It's not going anywhere. We like anger, we like thinking about it, talking about it, understanding it, and we thought this is a massive kind of upswell in interest on anger. Can we help people make sense of this in a bigger, more holistic way? Because we feared that we were missing kind of the big picture. If you think about that old adage, if we're all seeing different pieces of an elephant, and we describe it in really different ways, but nobody really understands that it's an elephant that we're talking about, and not to torture the metaphor, we wanted to actually think about that elephant in the room and think about that from an anger perspective. Because if you look at the biggest buckets of anger in work related to ours, psychology, kind of cognitive and brain science, management, negotiation, each of those has focused on anger really deeply, but in a really different, almost largely non-overlapping way. So in psychology and a lot of the brain research, it focuses a lot on that experience of anger for the angry person. So physiologically and mentally and cognitively, what am I experiencing? One of our most interesting insights is that it actually doesn't matter so much who you are in that scene. It turns out the angry person, the target of that anger, and even just an observer actually feel a lot of the same physiological responses. Everybody's kind of
one another, sure.
Energy. It's an alerting emotion. It's more attention. Your heart rate goes up. Your blood kind of increases in flow. This kind of thing. So it's actually a really activating emotion, no matter if I'm the angry person or not, which we thought was actually really interesting. So physiologically, even being the recipient of anger can have a lot of the same short-term and even long-term effects as if you are the angry person, which was interesting. For the observer, so I'm just a third party, maybe I saw you in the white truck speeding down the road in that scenario. Often the research in psychology focuses on what did I see? So what was that initial stimulus? Did I see the angry person, or what caught my attention, and this kind of thing? For management, a lot of the focus has been on, understandably, situations between leaders and followers, for example. So I have an abusive supervisor or something like this. What do I do? And how we interpret that with relationships, behavioral responses. Do I take that anger and kind of bottle it up at work, but then enact it at home in some way or something like that? And then for negotiations, which is a lot of my work, it's often a lot of the response of the target. And that's some of my research too. So I'm also at fault here of thinking, okay, anger has happened. We don't really care so much how or where or why. Now, what do you do about it in a negotiation? Does it lead to impasse and reciprocal anger, as you had in your experience, or more productive question asking and then value creation, this kind of thing? And the third piece, and this is how the field has evolved over time, is that anger is a negatively valenced emotion, but is it bad? No. Is it good? No. It's kind of all of it. It depends, right? So the field initially kind of moved towards anger can be helpful. And then recently it was more, well, anger can be both harmful and helpful. And we thought, well, that is one perspective, but it's still very much almost a static snapshot of anger. And if you remember that garden hose metaphor, anger has to move. It has to flow. So we wanted to focus more on what if we took a life cycle approach to anger, not just in an individual episode, but also what does that mean over time?
Really kind of a new framework of thinking about it, right? We're zooming out from the concept a little bit, which, as you mentioned earlier in your advice, is practically useful as kind of a strategy for combating anger, but also changing the way that we think about it, right? To allow us to understand that we have this emotion for a reason, that it helps us. In some cases, can do harm if not adequately harnessed in the right direction. So it's a very interesting perspective. So let's return for a second to these 4 dimensions and the 2 themes with some real world examples or practical applications. So it's a beautiful model. How can we understand this, and can you give us some examples to allow us to wrap our minds around it?
Sure. If we could actually go back then, and I'll talk a little bit more through those 4, the 4 organizing dimensions and the 2 themes, because I think that really, it sounds complicated, but we'll walk through it. It's not, but it really helps you sort of make sense of it as you go, and then some of the guidance that we give will be more useful too. So if you remember the water flowing from a garden hose.
Yes.
So if you think about first the roles, who's in that scene? There's somebody holding that garden hose. There's an angry person. It's pointed maybe at someone. If so, that person is the target, and someone else could be watching you pointing that hose. So that's an observer. So you have the angry person, the observer, and the target, and those roles can change and morph over time too. So time was also something that we wanted to look at of even within a role, so what we call an episode in research, you started out feeling perhaps like a target, and then you also became angry. So thinking about that reciprocal anger is actually really interesting too, because it adds a new layer of complexity on what's happening in the scene. And we know that people often respond either with reciprocal, same emotion, or what's called a complementary emotion. You might have felt fear, kind of an opposite reaction, or honestly, even both, which some of my work on ambivalence shows is not just possible, but highly likely, right? The second part of that were the phases. And I've mentioned this a little bit, but it's worth thinking about more specifically. Everybody starts with some sort of stimulus. So if you're the angry person, it's that trigger, that perceived moral or norm violation or goal frustration, personal goal frustration. But if you're a target or an observer, you're seeing that anger. You're seeing somebody maybe narrow their eyes or look aggressive or something like this. So everybody kind of has that initial, the scene is starting for me in this moment kind of thing. And then we've got to start making sense of it from that moment. And now for control, which is I think where everybody wants to focus. And that is that when you look at the roles, at the phases, the stimulus, experience, and response, and that response can be cognitive, behavioral, et cetera. And then time, there are ways that you can control kind of in each of those pieces and overlap. So imagine like an in-dimensional sort of matrix thing. And in the paper, we have a few kind of easy charts to help show, and I think we'll go through one on the next slide. But thinking about, do I change my sensitivity to a cue, or do I change where my attention is focused? Because that scene doesn't start for me as an observer or target until I notice that angry person in some way. And the two underlying dimensions that probably were obvious in thinking about the metaphor of the garden hose for you is first that intensity. How much water is coming out? And is it the right intensity? And actually, we were very, very careful. Many people think, oh, my job is just to tamp down anger, right? To down-regulate it. There are actually situations in which it's useful to upregulate anger. And those who are more adept at those pitfalls/opportunities are better at seeing those opportunities when I need to amp up my anger to be most productive in the situation, right? And the second one is then, where is that hose pointed? So is it pointed directly at that trigger? So that target is the trigger? Is it just pointed at anybody who's around, kind of splaying indiscriminately? Or is it kind of pointed maybe at the ground or off into space or something so that there's no direct target? And we can walk through a few ways of that.
So let's do that. So we teased this for a second. Let's go a little bit deeper into it. So I think a lot of what you're saying is making a lot of sense. And I love the garden hose analogy. It's very useful to me because a garden hose is a tool, your anger is a tool. So let's talk about using this model. What might that look like in practice? Can you give us some examples of tamping that up or redirecting and what that might do in a situation?
Right, and I'm glad the metaphor lands and that's the key, you just need enough water. Overwatering is just as bad as underwatering in some situations, right? So it's just recognizing, am I doing this well for this situation? So this 2x2 is one of the most helpful that we found to explain this idea of intensity and direction. And you notice there are two words on each of the axes here, because one is to describe the current state and another is to describe what you can do about it, right? So let's say when you were with the car coming behind you dramatically down the street, there was an angry person driving that other car and you felt, did I do something wrong? So maybe I'm the trigger and also the target, they're being aggressive towards me. So you might have thought, okay, we're in this top left situation, right? Where it's focused on me, it's strong. And so you might think, okay, well, can the person either weaken or dampen that anger, so make that a little bit less dramatic towards you, or maybe they can redirect it. So, and that's where we often, on this bottom row, we can see, if you're angry at me because I did something, but then you take it out on a colleague, you have redirected that anger to a target who was not actually the trigger. And that can be really hard to distinguish sometimes because we often think, what's happening? Why are you angry at me? It doesn't have anything to do with me. I just happened to be there, or happened to be the next person that you saw, or happened to be somebody who was kind of around. And the no target, this is one of my favorite kinds of ways of thinking about redirection, is when maybe you go for a walk, Or there's a great study about punching bags, and that can be useful. The caveat here is, if you go for a walk or if you punch the punching bag, don't punch the wall. The punching bag is better. Don't ruminate over what's just happened.
Okay.
That makes it worse. So the key of that no target, of just kind of putting it into space, is to use it as a distraction. And that can be, honestly, some of the most effective ways. Just distract yourself. Don't ruminate. The rumination will be bad, but distract.
That's great advice. I feel like I've been trying to live this out in my own life, and a lot of times I get engaged with that rumination where I lose a little bit of the focus of what I'm trying to accomplish, and that my escape activity actually just sometimes make me feel worse. So you have to be very intentional about that. I think that's a really nice piece of practical advice. So let's kind of take again to a very meta question. Why does this matter? How does the idea that anger is a garden hose that flows and directs, what are the implications of that kind of from a more big picture standpoint?
Right, and I appreciate you asking that question. You sound like some of our reviewers
Sure.
on the paper. But really, we thought this would be, the metaphor of a flow and that dynamic life cycle helped us do a few things. So first, it helps nudge us past this idea of the freeze frame. So you're angry, what do you do? What triggered that? Okay, stop. Or negotiation, somebody's angry at you, how do you respond? Because it doesn't get that full picture of the scene or what it means going beyond. So, kind of thinking, okay, the angry person has been triggered, but then what's the role of that angry person going forward? How do we play that out through the whole scene? And for the target and the observer, it doesn't just stop at a certain point when they respond, for example. It also helps us see how those dimensions and the themes of intensity and direction are interconnected over time. And you can torture the metaphor as much as you like. I still think it works pretty well, of thinking, have I flooded the yard? Now what? Okay, I've got to deal with this kind of aftermath of that. And, somebody was angry at me. I got angry really quickly back. Okay, now I've actually changed my role in that scene. So I snatched that garden hose away from them to point it where I wanted to now. Or maybe we're fighting over the garden hose. Again, you can torture the metaphor more or less as you like. But it also helped us connect some of the interesting work that we focus on less in organizational behavior and management, I think, but that's really useful, of some of that physiological and long-term cognitive implications, right? Because we know that those changes in heart rate or alertness or brain activity, and it's really cool to see how the brain just flashes when the anger is in the room, translate into long-term stress or disease even. There's some depression and other mental illness correlations, and even trait anger. So how is that kind of feeding on itself over time and across those episodes? And even bleeding more into community level events, or kind of broader group level or team level in an organizational setting. So this is a simplified, this graphic that you see here is a simplified version of what's in the paper. But it gave us a way to walk through, if you had a cheat sheet that you could take from the paper and carry with you in the car for the next time that kind of situation happens. You might say, all right, first let's assess the situation. What is the direction and the intensity? How much water is coming out of that hose? And then what started it, perhaps, if I can tell, and knowing that I could be wrong, but at least it's one hypothesis. And who are the people in the scene? Who's holding that hose? Who's the angry person? Who's the target? Maybe it's me. Was I the trigger? Different question. And where is it focused? Am I observer? Can I play a role, et cetera? Kind of understanding that basic scene then allows you thinking about all the other things that can influence it. My own emotional intelligence capabilities, my own perceived power in that scene, the historical roles of everybody there. We know kind of with strangers is different than with people you know well, or managers, or this kind of thing. Do I intervene? And if so, how do I do that? Do I just try to control the intensity, just the direction, maybe both? So we have those little knobs that you can kind of try to tweak in a little bit of a different way. And then where do I intervene? So, if people are in the middle of a yelling match, it might be a little bit late to try to change that stimulus phase. They're way past that, but you might be able to move how they're responding behaviorally or cognitively, right? And so recognizing where I have the opportunity to do that, then kind of doing a post-mortem and thinking, did it work? How did it work? And then how does that influence then how things go the next time? Am I more sensitive to triggers? Laura's got a really short fuse. She's going to get angry all the time, so I better watch out. Maybe I can help her frame it differently so that she doesn't have that initial stimulus phase, so that we don't even start the scene in the next situation, for example.
Yeah, it's a tool we all have. It's a tool that we should use responsibly. It's something that I think we could all benefit from if we were able to understand how it operates, how it flows, and the impacts that it has, and some of the options that we have when experiencing these types of scenarios. Very interesting. I could talk about this all day. It's something that is very intuitive and very exciting. Thank you for the thoughtful and engaging conversation. I'm going to switch now to the more interactive portion of today's event. So this is a moment for you all to join the dialogue directly with Dr. Rees. If something that has been sparked during our conversation earlier comes to mind, now's the time to dive a little bit deeper. So I will ask you, please use Zoom's Q&A feature to share your questions and reflections. And to help us get started, I'm going to take the privilege of posing the first question. So in a high stakes or emotionally charged environment, so you've given us a few good examples, negotiations, performance reviews that didn't go my way, maybe a team conflict, I'm not getting along with somebody on my team. What evidence-based strategies can individuals use in real time to help regulate and channel their anger constructively without always just suppressing it?
And I love that you added that not always just suppressing it. I think that's really important to know because anger is useful. All emotions are neither good nor bad, they're just there. And so the key is how do we use them most effectively? And so I'll harken back to something I said at my terrible joke from the beginning, that emotions are social information. So if you think about emotions as information, a lot of the advice about emotions is what we have learned or also apply with cognitive information, right? When you feel, when you're surprised by the information or you're overloaded by the information or it wasn't what you were expecting or something like this, often a lot of those same techniques will work here. So take a step back, slow down the situation, stop and think, what's happening, right? If I suddenly started spouting Wikipedia facts to you, you'd say, whoa, 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 hang on, give me a second. What's the context? What are you telling me this for? A lot of the same kind of idea, right? So if I come at you with my veins pulsing and I'm breathing heavily and I'm waving my arms dramatically and I'm so angry, you might say, hold on, help me understand what's happening in the situation, right? I think one of the problems with emotions is that we tend to react in one of three ways. We ignore it, they're just not there, which as we know from neuroscience, that's just wrong. Or we downplay it. Oh, they're there, but they don't really matter, or it's not professional, or I'll just overcome them or something like this. And we want to get over them. Because again, they're not professional or we're uncomfortable with them because we spent a lot of our lives unlearning how to pay attention to this really important precognitive cue of what's happening in the situation. And we tend to want to do all of those things very quickly, right? So because we feel uncomfortable or maybe we don't know how to address them or something like this. So one of my answers is actually not one that maybe people will like, and that is you have to practice. The more you pay attention to emotions, the more emotional intelligence, and it's not just kind of basic, okay, they're feeling bad, etc. One of the key skills is emotion granularity. And that's going from, do I just say, oh, well, Jay seems kind of as if he's in a bad mood. It's very vague, it's not very helpful. But the more granular you can get of saying, I think he's probably frustrated by what happened. He might be disappointed that I didn't speak up in the meeting when he thought I would. Maybe he's actually a little bit worried or scared about what might happen in this situation. The more granular you can get, the more you can understand, okay, this is what it all means and how maybe I can respond to that.
Certainly. I'm going to follow up on that a little bit because one of the things I found really interesting about your model was this third-person observer. We live in this society right now that almost seems engineered to control our emotions and to direct them in areas that maybe can trigger this feeling of anger. And it's not oftentimes that we think about this idea that maybe this third-person experience could lead to the emotional reaction as well. So considering all this information, to return to one of your earlier concepts, this idea of social information, which we are now inundated with, what advice might you have for our viewers in regards to how can we control those emotions that are maybe being stimulated in us in situations that we may not always be directly involved in?
Sure, and the research shows that that's actually really common. I don't need to be the one that was that saw the violation or had my goals frustrated. I can be mad on your behalf if I saw that truck, I might think, what were they doing? Jay was just being a nice driver in downtown Corvallis. And so it's incredibly prevalent. And again, I would say a lot of the same techniques that we know about cognitive information, kind of taking a step back. There's some excellent research by Ethan Kross and others on self-distancing, of honestly, even metaphorically kind of removing myself from the scene and looking down on it. So instead of saying, I'm so angry because, just think, oh, Laura's kind of angry because it sounds silly, but just kind of taking that moment to psychologically take a step back and remove yourself from that scene can really, really help. And a couple of other tips that we use in negotiation research, because everything is a negotiation, are two. So the first one is think about the why behind your reaction, the other person's reaction. What is the emotion telling you? So in the sense, if the anger, in negotiation research, we always distinguish between the position, the what I'm asking for, and the underlying interest, the why. So if you say, can I have your water bottle? That's the what. And I say, no, I love this water bottle. I have my Benny the Beaver stickers. It's, my personal thing. But if I thought to say, why are you asking for my water bottle? And you say, well, I'm just so thirsty. I might say, well, I have another one you can borrow, or something like this, right? So we can solve the problem when we focus on that interest, often in better or more creative ways than when we focus on that position. So think about your emotion as the position. Okay, I'm angry, or this person seems angry. If you think, why are they angry? What was that personal goal frustration maybe that happened? Or what was that moral or perceived norm violation that they thought would happen? That it doesn't discount the emotion, but it treats it as that really interesting and useful information. Help me understand kind of the underlying thing that's happening here. And the other thing, and I know I'm getting excited, but I warned you, is what's called the interest rights power framework in negotiation. And think of it kind of like a bullseye. And those interests are at that middle core. And that's hard to keep focused on, but really key in finding those good solutions. So interest we talked about is that why, the thing that I need addressed, or that's really bothering me, or something like this. The rights is more, well, it was in the handbook, or they said I could do it, or this is the law even. That's where a lot of those legal arguments happen. And power is, I can make you do it, or you can make me do it, right? And often, particularly with anger or disputes, or when we get overwhelmed, we almost resort to those rights and power arguments because they just feel more natural, they're easier. It's hard to take that step back and really focus on that interest. But the more you can kind of focus on that bullseye, I think is really, really helpful. And I mean, you asked about, being overwhelmed kind of with current events or things that are happening. The more we think about what's the why underneath that, not so much the rights or the power that people might be using. I think that's productive, at least for dialogue.
I love that answer. There's a core of humanity.
Yes, we think.
At the center of the apple that we all share. And sometimes
Right.
it's hard to lose sight of that when we're overtaken by our emotions in ways that aren't always constructive. I'm going to turn to the audience here. So there is a question coming in from one of our viewers. So in your research, or in any existing research that you may have come across as you've studied this topic, have you seen that there's any differences in the ways that men and women are allowed to use anger? There's kind of this general perception that there's not an even playing field in terms of the extent to which different types of people are able to utilize this tool.
Definitely, and I wish it weren't the case. And I always hesitate about talking about stereotypes in this kind of research because on the one hand it can be really discouraging and disheartening. On the other hand, there is some work showing that if you don't know or aren't aware of a stereotype in that situation, you're less influenced by it. So I almost hesitate to say, well, these are the stereotypes against people wearing OSU collared shirts, because then I don't want you to act differently in a way that might disadvantage you if you're wearing an OSU kind of collared shirt. But definitely, there's a ton, not just of gender, but race and culture. Any of the demographics that you can think of, there are differences in what we know about how people can or cannot or are perceived to be able to use that kind of tool. And even how it propagates stereotypes. I mean, we know that people are more likely to see anger in certain contexts or with certain kinds of people, even if it's not being expressed. It's just a heightened sensitivity to assuming some things are going to happen. So I think that reiterates this idea of kind of teaching yourself and practicing. It's social information. What am I seeing here? Why am I seeing it? Because we're also likely to be susceptible to some of those kinds of biases and stereotypes and et cetera. And how can I use this in a way so that anything working against me, I can overcome or make a non-issue, if at all possible? Or if not, what are my recourses to maybe get someone else to help or some other way to make that happen? I wish I had a better answer, to be honest. I think it's a fantastic question. Many people work their entire careers on gender and bias and all of this kind of research. That's the best advice I think I could give.
Information is power, and I love that response because understanding, I think, is the first path toward managing that for ourselves. In some ways, it's a loss of power in the fact that this social information exists outside of our control and in a society that has evolved and created for a very specific purpose that we don't always have full control over. So being able to understand that allows us to be able to operate within those confines. And so although, yeah, it's not a perfect answer, it is useful. And I think understanding the theory here is something that is very empowering. Here we have a listener from Switzerland. This listener was wondering whether there are any cultural specific reactions to our expressions of anger. So is there something, you briefly touched on this earlier. I'd be curious to hear you elaborate, and our listener from Switzerland would as well. How does this differ across cultures, across nationalities, across entirely different populations of people?
And it's another great question, and the answer is yes. I mean, I feel like I'm just always saying yes and to every question that you're asking. But a couple of things. So one, from earlier when I was mentioning about that ideal affect and expressivity. So we know that some emotions and different levels of that intensity are more normative or less normative in any given culture. I'm probably fairly expressive for a typical, maybe assumed US kind of culture, but in others I'm quite tame. So a lot of it can depend on what's considered more normative in that society, or how much people use their hands or arms, etc. The really most interesting idea, and of course it can't ever be proven or disproven because it's based on evolutionary theory, is that cultures with more immigrants tend to be more emotionally expressive. Because if you think about how we communicate with words, right, and language, if we don't necessarily have a shared language, my expression can actually be more useful in showing like, "Ooh, I'm scared," or "I'm really angry at you." And so there's some really interesting work at a macro level, country level, but also even within countries, areas that have more versus less immigration tend to be relatively more expressive versus less expressive, which I just think is one of the coolest and most interesting. If you travel, observe that and see if that jives with your experience. Yeah. But once you kind of understand, okay, that baseline is changing, even within the same country, you can't assume that. I mean, with some of my work on culture, there are up to 11 different cultures within the US even. So it's hard to say a national culture in that sense. But there's some great work on appropriateness and that logic of appropriateness of emotions and emotional expression. Deanna Geddes and others have done some of this work. And if you think about a band, and the bottom is basically, has it been seen? So sometimes it's so subtle that somebody who's used to more expressivity may just miss a cue entirely. Like they just don't see the information that you're trying to convey, which could lead to more frustration. For example, is that bottom, so does the person see it? And at the top, is it too much? It seems inappropriate in that. And the sweet spot is that band of appropriateness in the middle. That's where we often get more productive responses and more kind of what we're looking for or hoping to get out of that conversation. So you want to be careful. It's enough such the person actually recognizes the cue, because we all think that we are better communicators than we are. You know, it was so obvious that I was upset at that, Jay. How could you not see? And you're like, I didn't see anything. Yeah. And then is it too much such that the person is overwhelmed or shuts down or kind of walks away? And so you've got that in general, and then that can change based on culture and also how the cultures overlap. If you're more or less expressive than I am, lots of room for fun miscommunication that can happen there. It's
an interesting approach, and I never considered that, and this jives really nicely, I think, with your underlying drumbeat of this is information, right? This is a way that we communicate. It is universally understood, though not universally utilized, and so there's nuances there that even within a country like the United States, where there's huge cultural variations in terms of people's emotional expressions and how that's considered appropriate, is a really nice idea, I think, to keep in mind as you're navigating this complex world full of very interesting people. Final question for you. So some of the advice and techniques are rational, yet anger is emotional. So there's a little bit of a disconnect that our viewer is hitting on here, where it feels like a lot of this lives up here, where a lot of the emotion lives maybe down here in the heart. So the challenge for the angry person is to think rationally when triggered. How do you reconcile that discrepancy?
Yeah, I think there are several layers to this question, and I'm actually glad it came up because emotions are rational. And I'm a former economist, so I get emotions seem like the opposing of rationality and logic, and they're not. Yeah. And I think that is a really critical mindset shift of assuming that emotions are not rational and we need to shift. No, emotions are very rational. It's more just kind of thinking about them in that way. And if you remember, they're precognitive part of that is nested anyway, but a lot of it has to do with how we appraise, right? To recognize, I'm just hungry right now. I'm not actually upset with anybody. Let me go get a Snickers, as that commercial used to say, right? And to harken back to some really classic work on System 1 and System 2 processing, Kahneman, Tversky, right? Emotions tend to be in that more rapid, intuitive, really non-deliberative, initial, very quick response. And that's very evolutionary, right? If a tiger is coming, I don't need to stop and think, am I quite fearful or am I anxious? Like, I need to run and get out of the way. But it's learning to make that more intuitive System 1 response better able to serve you. So often we think, okay, emotions are up here in System 2. I need to really think about it and be careful and identify and who's in the scene and all these things that I've talked about. But we know that the more you practice that System 2 stuff, the more you can bump that down to intuitive System 1 processing. And that's why I said it's not easy. The joke again. But the more you practice with emotions, the less effortful in System 2 and what people would call rational, it seems, it becomes much more intuitive. And that actually can help you in lots of ways. So another reason not to ignore or downplay or get over emotions is that you're ignoring this huge influence that's going to show up, probably in yourself too. But if you can actually learn and educate and practice as much as you can, you're bumping that down to that more intuitive response, which is helping you, saving that cognitive space for bigger questions, and you actually get a better response out of it too.
Great. So I'm going to turn over the floor to you now. Any kind of closing thoughts, any takeaway messages for our audience today?
I do have one quote, if I can share it, from Aristotle, because why not? It makes it look very serious. And I think, the fact that he said this so many centuries ago just shows how kind of ever-present and powerful these ideas of emotions are. But he said, anybody can become angry. That's easy. But to be angry with the right person, to the right degree, at the right time, and for the right purpose, in the right way, that's not within everyone's power, and that's not easy. So this stuff, this is why I'm fascinated by it, why I've chosen to make my career in researching this. It's hard, but it's really interesting and helpful. I hope some of these tips are helpful for you and for the audience in managing and embracing those wonderful things called emotions that make us messy and human.
Great. Thank you, Laura. And thank you to our audience for engaging with us today. This is our final Thought Leadership Series for the academic year, but we will be back in the fall. We look forward to hosting you again then. In the case that you'd ever like to revisit any of our Thought Leadership Series talks, you can access them anytime on our website. Keep an eye out for a follow-up survey coming your way. Your feedback is incredibly invaluable as we continue to enhance these experiences and deepen our connection with you. Go Beavs.